Thank you very much, Michelle. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third of a 5-day series of our annual symposium entitled Journey Through Time, the Historical Human Quest for a Good Life. On today's program, we're going to address one of those 6 quests, or struggles that humankind have experienced for a very long time. The issue today is the human quest for equality. I would invite you to look at your program to see the background of our very, very qualified speaker today. And rather than go over that very, very impressive history and life of our guest speaker, I would invite you to read it at your convenience. Let me begin my introduction with another aspect to our speaker. Last year, in our journey through time, and again this year, we have experienced messages from historical figures who have been dedicated to this issue. We have heard from such crusaders as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mohammed Gandhi, Rosa Lee Parks, William Wilberforce, Nellie Gary, and William Lloyd Garrison, among others. All of these people, and many others that I have not mentioned, spend their life through dedication and commitment to certain standards and qualities of character that distinguish those special people in this great struggle for equality. I would have to candidly state that our struggle for freedom has been more successful at an earlier time than that has been for equality. As Thomas Jefferson indicated yesterday, the issue of freedom under the First Amendment has had a much longer history. That does not in any way take away from the need for equality. And those who have given us that message and given us the path to follow have had such qualities as being gentle, caring, supported, a friend, a spokesperson, a champion, and an advocate for those who have been less fortunate than the majority by being denied equality under the law. These same people have also been committed, dedicated, candid, and above all courageous to fight oftentimes an unpopular struggle. Many of them have even given their lives for this cause, including Dr. King and Mr. Gandhi. But it never caused them to deviate from the path of that democratic principle called equality. They all had substance rather than superficial advocacy of this principle. I would suggest to you that there are 3 essential principles for a democracy is not full blown, and those are freedom, justice, and equality. Our speaker today has all of these qualities. I have known him for a very long time. I have worked closely with him in this struggle. Our guest, Bill Wassmuth, has always consistently supported all of those descriptions that I have given you. He has done something else that all these great people have done. He's not just asked for tolerance for those who are different, but he's always asked for acceptance and, above all, the celebration of all peoples, of all races, colors, and differences. I have said to Bill on many occasions, and I recall saying this in the presence of some leaders in our country with him one day, and when I'm upset, I say to him sometimes, I'm afraid that some people's hearts are in the wrong place. And when I am celebrating with others that are doing the struggle, and I am so proud of them, I say to Bill, their heart is in the right place. Our guest speaker today, Bill Wassmuth's heart is always in the right place. You will see on your program that he's been recognized for this struggle. He has received, among other awards, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Award from the National Education Association, as well as the Rosa Lee Parks Award from the American Association of Affirmative Action. Our guest is really home today. He was the pastor at St. Pius Catholic Church for many years, and we worked together in the task force on human relations of Kootenai County, and we worked together with the creation of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, where he is now Executive Director. Let's welcome home for a powerful speech today our friend, Bill Wassmuth.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks to all of you for the welcome. It is good to be here, and it does feel like coming home. It's always great to be in Coeur d'Alene, to feel the energy and the spirit that's here. So I thank you for the welcome, and I thank you for taking the time to spend some moments thinking about this subject and sharing some thoughts and reflections. It's great to be here to be a part of the Popcorn Forum. It's a great subject, an exciting topic, the quest for the good life. Today, the quest for equality, which I'm going to use the words quest for human rights. As I studied it, that seemed to be the words that I wanted to work around best. It's a wonderful week, and congratulations to Tony Stewart and to all others who are responsible for it. It's great to be here at NIC as well. 10 years ago this week, the Northwest Coalition was launched at a meeting held here in Coeur d'Alene, and the founding papers of the Northwest Coalition were signed here on campus at North Idaho College. And since that time, the Northwest Coalition has expanded in terms of staff and in terms of geography as well. We now include Colorado with the other 5 northwestern states. But most importantly, the Northwest Coalition has become a leader in responding to the constant threat of racism and bigotry in these 6 states now. And last December, tied a bit to what we're doing today, the Northwest Coalition was honored by the United Nations chapter in Seattle for its work on human rights on International UN Human Rights Day last December 10th. So it all seems to kind of come around in full circle. This coming Friday here, we're going to have a 10th anniversary acknowledgement of the Northwest Coalition. Our board of directors from around the region will be meeting Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. On Saturday night, we're having a leadership gathering that's hosted by the Kootenai County Task Force and the Northwest Coalition, and you saw some flyers about that as you came in. Certainly invite you to be there for that leadership evening up at Coeur d'Alene Inn. It's going to be a good time, an important time for us all to take another step in the direction of securing equality, of opposing bigotry and racism, building communities that are committed to human rights. So that's Saturday night. Doors open at 6. Program begins at about 7 at the Coeur d'Alene Inn. Urge you to be there. Help build communities committed to human rights. Some pundits would say that one should never start a presentation with an apology, but I'm going to anyway. This isn't exactly my area of expertise. Most of you know my history. You know me from when I was a pastor here in Coeur d'Alene, or as chair of the Kootenai County Task Force. I became chair, as those of you remember that incident, that story, became chair as much by default as anything. A couple of folks came to my office one day when the task force was struggling and said, we need a new chairperson because the previous chairperson has moved out of town to a different assignment, and we want you to do it because your church building is made of brick and you don't have any children or a wife for the Aryans to harass in case we get into trouble, and so you're the perfect one for leader. With such a strong support and applause for my leadership capabilities, how could I say no? And then my real expertise in the subject, as many of you remember, came at the receiving end of a pipe bomb. That after my house was bombed by people who were members of the Aryan nation, suddenly I was an expert in the whole arena. But it's not my area of study or education. And so on this, when I was preparing for this subject, I had to go back to the books, and I appreciated doing that, actually. On the other hand, equality and human rights basic concept comes from my family background and from my training. It did prepare me for this presentation in one sense, because I've learned from childhood that there is a right way to treat people and a wrong way to treat people. And when we're dealing with equality issues and human rights issues, that's essentially the basic concept. What's the right way to treat folks, and what's the wrong way? So I have a basic foundational conceptual presentation, attitudinal basis, if you wish. But I did do some study for this presentation, and I hope that some of the thoughts that I found and put together will be of interest and of help to you. Certainly, human rights, equality are issues that are very much alive today. They're vital issues. They're constantly being debated. Just a couple of examples. The whole new thing of the computer internet and right to privacy and right to be protected from obnoxious and harmful kinds of information. The questions of free speech as they now appear on the internet. Crime and punishment, capital punishment, rights of prisoners, rights of victims. Questions that are constantly being thrown around, discussed in our society as well. Fascism and Dictatorship. An interesting new book that has come out that suggests that some of the things we're doing in the United States are heading us in the direction of becoming a fascist society. Whether you agree with that conclusion or not, the premise is that some of the taking away of freedom that we're experiencing these days could be leading us in that direction. Policy with foreign nations, particularly in relation to China, where human rights comes up all the time. Do we enforce human rights in our trade agreements with other countries? President Carter took a strong stand on this some years ago and adopted a foreign policy that was very contingent on human rights. That kind of emphasis has declined in recent years. Or the UN involvement. When does the violation of basic human rights in a country cry out for intervention by the United Nations? That's being debated daily in numerous parts of our world. And now that human rights with the United Nations Declaration have become international law, how do we enforce that as a society on this globe? The ongoing question of racism, here in our country as well as in other countries. A basic human right that is being denied so many. Still very much a question that we've not come to conclusion on by any means. Women and human rights in relation to gender, economic, political, societal power, again, both here and in other societies as well, an ongoing discussion, an ongoing issue. Genocide. As we move farther and farther away from World War II and the Jewish Holocaust, but are reminded that genocide is still possible in our society as we look at Rwanda and Bosnia in recent years. The list could go on and on and on, but I only cite some examples to call to mind again for all of us here that human rights, equality issues are in the news daily, are on our minds constantly as individuals and as society. So let's take a little historical look. Where did all this come from? What about this notion of human rights? What I'm going to do this morning is work a bit toward a history of human rights, and then globalize that by talking about some of the impact of the major religions of the world on human rights, then move in the direction of a definition of human rights, and then talk about some of the incidents or stories, historical stories of that struggle for human rights, just a few of them that we can pull from around the globe and throughout history. And finally end with some of the challenges that still face us today. From the earliest time, perhaps from the time when there were only a couple of people on this earth, men and women have cried out, "You can't do that to me. You can't do that to me." And you can't do it when pushed for a reason why. They ultimately said, "You can't do it because I'm a human being. I'm a person." And in one sense, no other reason is needed. But because power is so intoxicating and those who wield it often are very slow to recognize that human right and very quick to show cruel disregard for the lives, liberty, and well-being of others, this cry needs to go on constantly in our lives. You can't do that to me. Human beings need the protection of that cry because we, more than other creatures on this earth, seem to be vulnerable. Snails have houses that they carry with them, chameleons can hide, lions have speed and strength. Human beings seem soft and extremely vulnerable in comparison to some of the other creatures. And indeed, we might be the only species that needs protection from each other, more so than from other sources of power. So, to human beings, enter then the concept of society. We, being more vulnerable, are also capable of more effectively and intelligently cooperating than other animals. And within that cooperation is the growing realization that as human beings we possess something that can be called rights, that we're morally protected from aggression, from the aggression of others. To say that a person ought not be killed is an easily comprehensible moral statement, however much it is violated in practice. But the idea that leads to that is therefore somehow each of us has a right to life. The word right originally meant the powers exercised by someone who had a special position. So in this understanding, the word right is as old as society itself. Kings enjoyed appropriate rights. Office holders enjoyed certain rights. The Romans talked about fathers in their society focusing on rights called patria potestas. I just used a little Latin so you'd be impressed with my scholarly abilities. The powers of the father. And rights in that sense then distinguished a person from his or her fellows based on their position in society. So the right belonged to them because of their position. But then to move that term to encompass all human beings, to extend it to be universal, was very much of a development. The original notion used right to set one person off from another, the right of king, for example. But as development took place, the notion of right started to be applied to all human beings. So how to make that jump? And how to validate it? How to support it? People went to philosophy and to religion. And they looked to the notion of human nature, what it means to be a human being, because then it could be universal. So they looked for natural and physical laws that governed the proper functioning of things in our universe. And they saw human beings as being a part of that natural law, a part of that physical universe. And therefore they could determine how those human beings should live by looking at that nature, looking at those laws. And it was from that understanding of the nature of human being, as human beings fit into the whole of the world, that natural law came to be, and that rights flowed from that natural law. So the term evolved. First we heard of natural rights, and then in more recent that turned to human rights. The rights that are in question are the rights that belong to us essentially as human beings. In a way, we inherit them by the mere fact that we're born. Or to look at it from a little bit another perspective in terms of historical development, throughout history and in medieval times, Middle Ages as well, the moral concept that prevailed was the concept of duty. Duties set limits to human behavior. We all had duties based on our stature in life and our role in life, and we fulfilled our life by responding to those duties. Duties described what must be done in order to find fulfillment and happiness for everybody. So kings had duties, and slaves had duties, and everybody else had duties as well. Everyone had duties. But in the course of the 16th century, particularly in England, some things began to change. The concept of duty started giving way to the concept of right. Instead of beginning with the structure of creation and working to the concept of human rights, it went the other way around. Thinkers began taking their initial bearings from human beings and then deriving from that the structure and relationships that should exist between them. Now, this transition had far-reaching consequences. Kings grew restless under the tutelage of the Pope, for example, and rejected that kind of religious authority. Merchants broke free from the constraints that forbade usury and started charging interest. Adventurers decided they had a right to set off and seek their fortunes. The orderly, duty-ordered structure of the Middle Ages was breaking down. What was happening was the painful emergence of a new type of civilization. And one of the benchmarks, one of the real marks of that new civilization was the concept of rights that were basic to human nature and universal to all. An interesting little historical side note is that while this whole system was developing in Europe, particularly in England, European colonization of the world was taking place as well. And so those very people who were colonizing the far reaches of the globe were bringing to those colonies the very concept of human rights that would eventually provide the basis for those colonies to revolt, that would provide the basis for them to say, we have human rights too. In a way, they're saying, you colonizers brought this thought to us that we have human rights, now we're going to exercise that, go away. The concept of human rights was the basis for the revolt against the colonization of the European nations. Another one of the attacks that came on natural rights came from Karl Marx. He saw human rights as just describing a status, as merely a form. For example, he theorized, a slave has no right to property, though some slaves may well enjoy the use of their master's property. On the other hand, he said, a free person has the right to property, but indeed, in fact, may not possess any at all. So, is the right more important or the fact, he would say? Is the right to own property but not having any, more important than not having the right but indeed enjoying it? The free person has the right, but the slave has the use of the property in his example. So Marx said that the meaning of human rights could be discovered if one looked to what he said were the consequences, rather than to just some kind of theory. So he looked to membership in human society, not so much in terms of formal ideological sorts of explanations of human rights, but in terms of what actually were happening. The right to be paid for employment, he said, required that society make a job available for each person. And so rights, in his understanding, started moving in the direction of straightforward demands. So we see in the historical development of this concept of human rights kind of a split happening. In one understanding, they are guarantees of human freedom, personal safety, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the terms of our U.S. Constitution. But to Karl Marx and to communism, it was more important for citizens to have the right to a job, to low-cost housing, to free medical care, and to comprehensive universal education. These rights, they would say, are more important than civil liberties. And indeed, civil liberties, they would say, can be sacrificed to ensure these rights. Now, obviously, most people would prefer both of those directions at the same time. And in our world, it seems that when forced to choose, generally people would prefer to live in a society that cannot torture or jail them unjustly. Political freedoms and rights, it appears, are most important in their mind. But we must understand that there is also this drive in the world to implement the economic rights as well. So when we look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and we'll look at that a little bit more here in a minute, there's a provision, for example, of appropriate holidays with pay that's included as a human right. Obviously, this is dependent on the industrial development and level of a particular country. So as we look at the historical development of rights, it's going to vary from area to area, depending upon the development of various societies. Abstract notions, when they're applied in the concrete, are going to have different interpretations. So we talk of human rights now, not natural rights. Derivation has changed as well, no longer from an abstract philosophical analysis of natural being or natural reason, the essence of what it is to be a human, that Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophy, no longer so much from that, but rather from our ideas of what it means to be a human being. We think of a person who is malnourished, who is tortured, who is wrongly imprisoned, who is illiterate, or who perhaps is lacking in regular paid holidays, as not living in a manner appropriate to a human being. And so from this very brief historical perception, we can see that The notion of human rights is evolving from period of history to period of history, from generation to generation. And the impact that that has on society and the requirements of society to preserve those human rights changes as well. The United Nations 1948 Declaration list is much longer of human rights than lists previously developed. And the rhetoric of human rights has developed as well. It has been increasingly assigned to those who have been wrongfully denied the full status of human beings. These classes of persons include racial minorities, gays and lesbians, children and women, people with physical and mental disabilities. The international conference here in Coeur d'Alene several years ago on women's rights, speaker after speaker, for example, said, let's talk about human rights as they apply to women, not talk about women's rights as somehow distinct from human rights. So whether racial minority or religious minority, the cry is going out, you can't do that to me, today as it has gone out throughout history. Whether woman or child, you can't do that to me. Whether straight, gay, or lesbian, you can't do that to me. Whether poor or rich, you can't do that to me. The cry has gone out from earliest times and continues today. To take another look at globalizing this a bit, let's look at the world religions and their impact on human rights as a way of extending it to a global market, global perspective. If we examine the world's great religions for the words human rights, we will find very little. And yet, human rights and every religion are very much intertwined, because they both deal with the fundamental questions of human life. What does it mean to be a human being? What are we doing on this earth? How ought we relate to one another? The basic questions of every major religion, the basic questions of human rights as well. And so, as I mentioned in my introduction, I don't have formal training in the concept of human rights, as many of you do not have formal training either. But our religious background and our background in terms of how we respect each other can prepare us for understanding what these human rights are about very easily. So let's take a look at the Muslim world, the world of Islam. For the Muslim believer, a human person is a creation of God, and human rights hold before the believer a vision of what God would like them to be, would like the human being to be. God has a vision for human beings. Human rights are a way to achieve that vision. What God wants them to live for, to strive for, to die for. Human rights are given by God in the Islam perspective of things, and therefore no one can take them away. But since they're given by God, the source of them and the source of understanding them comes from the Holy Word of God, from the Quran, rather than from a study of human nature itself. So some of the human rights described, not in those terms, but still in the concepts in the Quran: right to life, right to respect, honor every human being, right to justice, right to freedom, right to privacy, right to protection from slander, backbiting, and ridicule. I found that one interesting. And tied in with our theme, very interesting, right to the good life. Justice is a prerequisite for peace, and peace is a prerequisite for human development. Now, many of us are probably saying in the back of our mind as we survey the present-day Muslim world, each day it seems human rights are more and more being eliminated, often in the name of God, as a chastisement for crimes against God. And that historical survey would provide very little evidence to support a strong Islamic support for human rights. And that's recognized within the Muslim world as well. As one Muslim writer put it, all a Muslim can say today with any measure of honesty is that if an idealistic Islamic society existed, then the rights of those who were part of this society would be recognized and would be enforceable. The same writer says, the Quran is a very liberating document which holds before us the sublime vision of our human potential, our destiny, and our relationship with God and God's creatures. If Muslims were to exercise all the human rights guaranteed to humankind by God, they would create a paradise on earth, and have no need to spend their time and energy dreaming about what is promised in an afterlife. And so in their own words, at the present time, in some parts of the Muslim world, there's a huge gulf between the ideals of the Quran and the realities of Muslim living. But those who believe in the Muslim religion, believe that human rights cannot be abandoned, even when they are denied and aborted, and they will continue to hope and pray and strive for the implementation and security of those rights. Buddhist teaching. Buddhist teaches that the struggle with the concept of human rights is tied to an understanding of human individual fulfillment in a societal context. For a Buddhist, it is impossible to think of an individual alone. Only can be thought of in cooperation with, as being a part of something larger. And so equality and liberty and security in Buddhist teaching are spoken of in a total perspective of human society. They only have meaning in that greater realm. Human rights are meaningless in their concept if they're just assigned to a single individual, if that individual is not seen in the context of a social institution, socially binding. So for a Buddhist, they seek a society or an ambiance that is conducive to individual life fulfillment in a way that is open, in a way that provides free contact for all. Finding this self-fulfillment in a societal context is the goal of human life and the essence of human life for them. Rights flow from this human nature and from its seeking fulfillment in that kind of a context in the Buddhist option. Hinduism is another religion for a large portion of today's world. And it has a particular challenge for human rights because it's wrapped in the caste system. But it doesn't mean, that caste system doesn't mean that there hasn't been a struggle for human rights and that Hinduism has not had an impact on human rights throughout the world. Mahatma Gandhi, for example, well known for his struggle for independence for the people of India, was also a leader within his own country for human rights in the struggle against untouchability and the impoverishment of the conditions of the caste system. And he wrote a statement that could well apply anywhere in the world. All are equal, he said. For though they are not of the same age, same height, same skin, and the same intellect, these inequalities are temporary and superficial. The soul that is hidden beneath this earthly crust is one and the same for all men and women. We belong to the same clime. The word inequality has a bad odor to it, he said, and it has led to arrogance and inhumanities, both in the East and in the West. But Gandhi did accept the caste system with its different rights and duties. And someone is born into a particular sex based on the activities of their previous life. And so while he didn't accept the inferiority or the superiority of that caste system, yet he did not accept and promote any kind of an alternative for it. So Hindu thinkers believe that to really pursue human rights among Hindus demands not only social reform these days, such as that launched by Gandhi, but also investigation and reinterpretation of the theoretical foundations that underlie the thought. Judeo-Christian tradition. Rights are as old as the Bible themselves. The Bible speaks of duties and obligations. Hence, they are realities that others have a right to expect. If a husband and wife have duties to each other, to respect each other, then they have a right to expect that respect as well. Rights are the concomitant of duties. So the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments can be seen as the expression of the duties of human beings to God and to each other, and hence the other way around, an expression of the rights of persons and the right of God. Thou shalt not kill. Persons have a right to life. So the person of Judeo-Christian tradition sees a different foundation for human rights. Rather than a study of human nature as the source, it sees the teaching of Scripture as the Word of God, and the Word of God being the source for human rights. The living out of those human rights are woven into the whole concept of salvation. Within one branch of that Judeo-Christian tradition, the Christian expression of human rights, the Catholic expression of human rights, especially as it's been developed in the past 100 years, there has come an anthropology that is seeing the basis for human rights to come both from the biblical as well as from the natural law. The Catholic perspective has also developed a distrust for individualism. That same individualism that has been the birthplace of much of the thinking of human rights these days. In the Catholic tradition, human rights of the individual must be seen in the context of the whole of society. Property rights, for example, cannot function to the exclusion of basic survival requirements for the poor. Unbridled capitalism, seen by some as a basic manifestation of human rights, is determined in Catholic tradition to be a violation of the rights of human beings for the basic satisfaction of needs, and therefore wrong. Hence, the Catholic is able to offer shelter to those who are repelled both by the neglect of economic and social rights for the disadvantages in liberal societies, and also to be a home for those who are repelled by the repressiveness of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. But within the Catholic Church, and I use this one a little bit more length because I am most familiar with it, we have a good example of the struggle that goes on for human rights in other churches as well, within other faith communities. For while teaching human rights, peace, and justice to the rest of the world, the Catholic Church, as well as other churches, struggle with the application of those same rights within itself and within its own structures. So within the Catholic Church, for example, in the revised Code of Canon Law, which is the code of laws governing the Church, there's no mention of human rights at all. And it could be argued that within the Catholic tradition there are some serious human rights problems. Participation and determination on the part of laity are not necessarily effectively exercised and protected. The exclusion of women from ministry and from positions of power would be said to be discriminatory, a violation of equal treatment. That ordained ministers are denied the right to marry. That theologians are restricted in their rights to freedom of inquiry and expression. The lay employees of the church are often denied rights to organization and to social benefits, and that due processes for the protection of rights are weak or non-existent. These are all struggles within the Catholic Church. They're struggles within many other faith communities as well. And so the struggle to shape the church itself, as well as society in accord with human rights, is an ongoing one. So, to look quickly at religions and the struggle in the world for human rights, some conclusions. Some of the most important developments in human rights struggle have come from the religions of the world. On the other hand, some of the worst violations have come from religions too. Inquisitions, witch hunting, crusades, genocide, conquests of whole people. And these atrocities continue in the name of God today as well. For the same voice that says that God has provided human rights can and often does also say that God has determined that certain human rights should now be sacrificed for any number of reasons. Some of the worst atrocities and violations of human rights in the history of the human race have been done in the name of God. And no one of the world's religions can claim a perfect record in promoting human rights for either its members or for the entire world population. So we must conclude that no one religion has the perfect base for human rights. If it did so, its record would be better. It may be best to see religious belief as something that strengthens and deepens the commitments of persons to human rights and to the movement of human rights today, as it has in the past. For the basis for human rights must be found outside of any one religious tradition. If not found outside the religious tradition, it is also subject to the foibles of that religious tradition. And this record of religions and human rights might also point out the importance to us of maintaining the separation of church and state. For theocracies have violated human rights repeatedly, whether the theocracy of the European conquerors of the Americas, or the Puritans of New England, or the Islamic rulers of Iran and other countries today. Religions of the world can strengthen and deepen the commitment of persons to human rights, but they are not an absolute assurance of the implementation of those human rights. So what's something of a definition of human rights? Positive rights come from law and are enforceable by law. To see what kind of a right we have in terms of positive rights, we go to a lawyer, we go to a court of law, we work it out, and it's fact. Not always does fairness enter into that. Hopefully, it does, but not always. The law, for example, and the positive rights flowing from that law say that a person may not steal from another person. And a starving person who steals food from someone that has more than enough food is in violation of law. Fairness would dictate that that person has a right to the food to avoid starvation, but the law says otherwise. So human rights and positive law are not always in sync. Human rights do not stem from a set of laws. They belong to a human person, as we've said before, simply because he or she is a human being. In the words of Jacques Maritain, the human person possesses rights because of the very fact that he or she is a person, a whole, a master of herself or himself and of their own actions, and which consequently is not merely a means to an end. The human person is never a means to an end, but an end in itself and must be treated as such. So human rights are universal, inherited. What are they? John Locke wrote of the rights to life, liberty, and property. The Bill of Rights enacted by the English Parliament in 1689 named also the right to trial by jury and prescribed that there should never be excessive bail or excessive fines, outlawed cruel and unusual punishment. In the United States, there was added the right to the pursuit of happiness. In the U.S. Constitution in 1789 and the concurrent amendments known as the Bill of Rights, these rights were defined in greater detail, and rightly so, since the purpose of that document was to start moving human rights into being implemented by making them part of American positive law. It was the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 that codified the list of human rights in its most complete fashion, and that has become the codification of it around the world. I know you're not going to all be able to see this by any means, but just to have you have it up here. And I also have some copies of it over here if any of you would like to grab a copy of it later and take it with you. I would encourage you to do so because you can spend more time with it than we're going to have an opportunity to do today. But this Declaration of Human Rights is a fairly comprehensive list. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That establishes the universality of it. Everyone is entitled to the freedom and rights set forth in this declaration without regard to distinction of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the security of person. No one shall be held in slavery. No one shall be subjected to torture. Everyone has a right to be recognized as a person. Everyone has a right to be, or no one should be subjected to arbitrary arrest. As we go farther down the line, we start getting into some of the economic rights. Everyone has a right to own property. Everyone has a right to freedom of thought, to freedom of expression and opinion, to freedom of assembly. Everyone has a right to take part in the government of their country. Everyone has a right to Social Security, not necessarily our Social Security program, but to Social Security. Everyone has a right to work, to a free choice of employment. This is the one I really like. Everyone has a right to rest and leisure. I would add skiing, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being. Everyone has a right to education. Education shall be free, at least in elementary and fundamental stages. Everyone has a right to freely participate in the cultural life of community. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration are to be fully realized. And then in Article 29, it talks about duties that people have in response to that. If we have rights, then we also have duties. So I'd encourage you to grab a copy of this and spend a little time with it. I think most of us knew that it existed. It was adopted universally by all the nations of the world in 1948. I think many of us knew that it existed. We point to it some on December 10th at United Nations International holiday. day of honoring the UN Charter for Human Rights. But as a matter of fact, we don't pay much attention to it individually or as a society, as a global world. As a matter of fact, even though this declaration was put out in 1948, it took till 1966 before two covenants to start codifying and putting into law, into United Nations universal law, some of these precepts. It took till 1966 for those covenants to be adopted by most of the nations of the world. And also, to our chagrin, the United States has never signed on to those covenants, has never taken the step to implementing this United Nations Charter. So we have a ways to go. It is inevitable, as this points out, that the rights of one individual collide at sometimes with the rights of others, and that sometimes the rights of individuals collide with the security of nations. In part, what the UN Charter is trying to establish is that never should United Nations take over individual rights to squelch them. Security and freedom are not at conflict. As Thomas Jefferson said, I think, and I should have asked him when he was here, those who would sacrifice freedom for security will wake up sometime to find that they have neither. A couple of stories of the struggle for human rights. In 73 BC in Naples, a man named Spartacus was sold into slavery into the Roman Empire. He was bought by gladiators to be a gladiator, by the promoters of gladiators, to fight each other and fight animals for the entertainment of the wealthy. Spartacus revolted and led a slave revolt. After several years and a lot of fighting, eventually he was defeated, but much had been accomplished because those who owned the slaves realized that they needed to start treating their slaves better or they were going to have more problems. And so concessions were made, concessions that continued through subsequent generations of Roman Empire times. That slave war, way back then, in BC times, was an important milestone on the way to the Emancipation Proclamation in our country and to other decrees, including the United Nations decree that says slavery not acceptable in any part of our world. In England, in the 11th, 12th century, when Richard the Lionhearted died, his hated brother John seized the throne. Eventually, with his oppression, caused the barons to rise up and to lead a revolt. The barons eventually succeeded in pushing John to make some concessions, and that Magna Carta was signed. The king could no longer steal inheritances, could not force people to do things that they didn't want to do. That Magna Carta initially applied only to land barons, to only about 10% of the population, but as history unfolded, it started being expanded and applied to more and more people. The Magna Carta serves as the foundation these days for many of the freedom declarations throughout the world. In Cuba, in 1952, General Batista knew from the polls that he would not be re-elected in the upcoming election. And so he took over absolute control and dictatorship and threw out Cuba's 12-year-old constitution. One of those who protested was a young lawyer named Fidel Castro. And after failing to find any recourse through the legal system, he decided that the only hope was a revolution. He led a small band of revolutionaries in 1953, only about 170 students. He was captured, he was sent to jail, eventually released, and he started organizing his movement again. In November of 1957, he was rolling through Cuba. He captured 150 soldiers of Batista. He reproached them for fighting against the Cuban people, let them go, saying that the rebels do not violate human rights. By December of 1958, most of Cuba was behind Castro against Batista. Batista fled with the national treasury to the Dominican Republic, and Castro was thrust into power. Cubans were delighted with their newfound freedom. Labor unions were again free. Universities were open and free. Press censorship ended. Government graft ended. Elections were promised. Socialistic laws were enacted to provide aid for the long-suffering masses of people, especially the landless peasants. Courts were set up to try the war criminals. Castro was very popular with the poor. He became less popular with the middle class because he often favored the poor at the expense of the middle class. and they were especially disillusioned when he violated his promise for free elections, free press, and free speech. These risks, he said, could not be taken until after the revolution had established the reforms solidly. Castro had gone over to the class struggle, the poor against the well-to-do, and in the process he'd reneged on his promises for freedom. Castro's is a case of revolution to establish human rights that only partially succeeded. And certainly the Cuban masses are better off today than they were under General Bautista in terms of economic care, medical care, universal education, low-cost housing, etc. But they are denied the democratic expressions of free speech and elections. Quick tour around the world. Human rights are a question around the world and have been throughout history. And if we had a status today, it's more than a dream, but less than a reality, human rights in our world. And it's clear that we as human beings have a long way to go. But it took centuries for the principles of the Magna Carta to be established in England and elsewhere. Maybe the same will be true for these United Nations human rights principles. The United States has a ways to go as well. We need to reconsider and re-examine our failure to sign on to the United Nations charters and covenants of human rights. We have failed and we have refused to sign them because, in a way, at least in part, I should say, we don't want to have anyone else in the world tell us where we might be failing. But that kind of arrogance will ultimately undermine our moral leadership in the world. We cannot urge human rights acceptance on other nations if we're not willing to undergo that scrutiny ourselves as well. Human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, recognizes that there is a universal moral code. We have to accept that if we are to continue to be a part of the universal leadership of the country, of the world. And we're not at the top of the list in terms of our following of human rights in the United States either. We rate, according to one study, number 19. 18 other countries in the world are more respectful of human rights than we in the United States are. We have work to do. Breaking down the wall of separation between church and state is the wrong direction to go in terms of protection of human rights. As I mentioned before, theocracies are generally not respective of human rights and all their citizens. And certainly armed vigilante groups, sometimes called militias, is not the direction of peaceful and reasonable defense either. The right to defense in the United States is the right to access to courts and to a system of law. Restricting freedoms of citizens in a vain attempt to establish security, also a wrong direction. That kind of violation of basic human rights will lead to the destruction of all rights. Fascism is still a possibility in any of the societies of the world, including our own. Human rights have been raised to an international level with a declaration from the UN. It is now international law. We can no longer stand idly by in our own country or anywhere in the world as human rights are being violated. In the words of former Governor John Evans on this very stage some years ago, to be apathetic in the face of bigotry is to somehow support it. To paraphrase that, to be apathetic in the face of the struggle for human rights is to somehow oppose it. To be a bystander in this struggle for human rights is to somehow support the atrocities that are still being committed in our world. As has been said at ancient times and is said still today, justice will not come until those who are not hurt feel just as indignant as those who are hurt. You can't do that to me. I am a human being. That cry has been heard throughout history. It is heard still today. If there's a challenge before any individual of us or all of us together, it's to respond whenever we hear that cry from our neighbor next to us or from our neighbor throughout this globe, that we respond by saying, yes, I agree. We can't do that to you, we can't do that to each other, and we won't. The struggle for human rights is as old as history itself. We are a part of that journey, each one of us, and I challenge you not to be a bystander. Thank you all very much. for questions and discussion if you'd like. And again, feel free to come up and pick up a copy of the UN Declaration if you wish. Any thoughts? Please.
Number 19, who's higher?
Okay. The question was, who is higher on this list than we are? Denmark, Finland, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, West Germany, Austria, Belgium, Canada, New Zealand, Switzerland, Australia, France, Greece, United Kingdom, Portugal, Costa Rica, New Guinea, USA. And one of the marks, according to this system, that we have to struggle with is one of the bad marks that comes across is the fact that we have capital punishment. In a world that says human rights, one of the rights is a right to life. That includes the right to life even if one is a criminal. And so capital punishment enters into this whole universal quest for human rights as well.
Does the media tend to underplay a lot of human rights?
She asked, does the media tend to underplay human rights? I would suggest that the media is reflecting what's in our society, and so in situations where human rights are alive and active, then the media plays it well. But for example, you won't read much about the United Nations December 10th Human Rights Day in the media because it's not held very high in society, so it's not going to get very much attention in the press either. Other questions or thoughts? Please.
You cited a book that a new book that suggests that we're headed towards fascism.
It's called The 15% Solution,
Okay, I think I've heard of
A Political History of American Fascism, 2001-2022. It's a very interesting book. I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. I've only gotten partway through it so far. It's written from the perspective of the year 2023 looking back, after the United States, according to its theories, has gone through a period of fascism. And it uses as its development of how we got to fascism in the United States, it uses quotations from various leaders and thinkers that are actually happening today. And it puts them together. It doesn't create things necessarily. It creates the composite and creates the conclusion. But it uses the thinking that's being done and the statements that are being made. I found it very interesting. For example, as we start restricting people's freedoms in the effort to combat drugs, for example, that they're suggesting that that kind of restriction starts leading to an authoritarian kind of control of society in which people lose basic freedoms. And the president that's elected, according to this book, in the year 2001, that establishes the fascism in our country, does so on the basis of the war on drugs. That he says we'll have finally a real war on drugs and we're going to do it this way, and in the process of doing that, he essentially eliminates human freedom. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't go after drugs as a problem in our society. That's not the conclusion at all. But I think it's a very interesting perspective that in pursuing some of our problems, we can do so in a way that's going to eliminate our freedoms. Please, ma'am.
What's the name of the book again?
It's called The 15% Solution. And I'll leave it here so that you can copy the more information off of it if you'd like. Please, ma'am.
Having thought a good deal about human rights and being subject to thinking about the future, how would you envision that we were going to handle the struggles that we go into? What do you envision for the future?
Ooh. What do I envision for the future? I think worldwide and locally in our own country, we're going to have a tough time for a few more years. I hope it's only a few more years. My own kind of light at the end of the tunnel that I hold out is that we got to get past the year 2000, that at least some of this is tied to the millennial 2000 apocalyptic kind of stuff, that people are panicked, that people are confused about what future to expect, and in some cases don't expect a future at all. And so it becomes easy to start sacrificing principle and start sacrificing human rights because we only here for a short while anyway. In the words of one former Secretary of the Interior, we don't have to protect the trees for future generations because it's all going to end anyway. So that same kind of thinking applied to human rights issues. We got to take care of now and do an immediate short-term solution. And the short-term solutions all too often aren't the solutions that protect the rights of everybody. We'll sacrifice human rights for the sake of the short-term solution. I see us headed into some very difficult, challenging times for a while. We're questioning some things, and we're moving in some directions that aren't good. That aren't good for our society and for human rights within our society, aren't good around the world either. And some of it is that really radical shift to the right. Not that being somebody who's conservative or who tends toward the right automatically means that you're a violator of human rights. I don't mean that at all. But when you move that shift to the right or to the far left, off to the extreme edges, and you get into some absolutism, absolutists don't like protecting the rights of people who disagree with them. And so as we head to those absolutist kinds of positions, we're going to be in trouble. And we're definitely headed right now in our society towards some of those absolutist positions. That makes me very, very nervous. Makes me very uncomfortable. I don't see that as a good sign at all. So I think we're in for some trying times. On the other hand, I see a lot of people who are increasingly saying enough's enough. And that's in a way what's happening on Saturday night here with the leadership gathering, is people are saying enough's enough. Let's stand up and do something about it. I see more and more of that happening. I hope that as we move through this millennium, end of the century, and get on into the 21st century, that we're going to say, we got to do some long-term thinking now. We got to do some long-term planning of society. We got to think beyond immediate short-term solutions. And the only way that this is going to work is if we really respect the rights of everybody. So let's get about implementing this UN Charter. Let's stop haggling over whether we can violate or submit ourselves to any kind of international law. Of course we can. Of course we have to. We are a global society. We are a global world. We have to do that. Let's just figure out a way to do it well and move on with it, rather than be a holdout for things like that. Sort of a rambling answer, but my crystal ball is a little hazy at the moment. Please, ma'am.
In what year did they start observing Human Rights Day, and was there a certain event that triggered this between President and Day?
It's a good question, and I'm only going to sort of guess at it. I assume that it happened after the UN Declaration in 1948 was signed. And I suspect that you would find that UN Human Rights Day was begun shortly thereafter. So the Declaration was signed in 1948. We have the 50th anniversary coming up next year, which might be an interesting time for us to focus a little bit more energy. Maybe things like the Popcorn Forum, for example, and other programs in 1998 can focus on the international UN direction of human rights. Please?
Do you think that it's best to concentrate on one specific area of human rights, or should we do it in a holistic?
Okay. She asked if we best focus on one area or if we should to do it all at the same time. I think that's a yes and a yes. I think that in order to be effective, often, whether individually or as organizations, we need to focus our attention so that we can put our energies in a direction and get something accomplished. On the other hand, we can never do that to somehow the exclusion of other rights. You cannot further racial questions, for example, if you're going to talk in sexist terms. You can't do that. So if you're focused in one area, you have to do it in a way that's respectful of the whole realm of human rights. On the other hand, to be effective, you might need to focus your effort down. One area that is most important. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't want to say most important, less important. I mean, I think it's you could build a case for a lot of them. I was in Sandpoint last night, and the question came up, and we were talking about children. We focus a lot of attention in our society saying we're doing this for our children, we're doing that for our children, we're doing this to protect them, we're doing that to protect them. And indeed, maybe we do. But on the other hand, as a society in the United States, we don't do a great job with our children. We don't provide them with what they need for education. We don't provide them with what they need in terms of family support and societal support. And it's not just money, it's time and effort and attention as well. And as a society, we don't come out relative to other societies in the world doing the greatest job with our children by any means. So somebody to focus on the rights of children, if you want, in terms of they have a right to a good education and to some peace and security. Those kinds of things would be very good and be very interesting to me. I think on the other hand, you could also focus some attention individually and as groups on capital punishment. I really have serious reservations, and I know this is a hotly debated question in society, and some 75% of people believe that capital punishment is good. I don't understand how we can preach respect for life when we as society kill people. It just doesn't make sense to me at all. How do you teach people that killing is wrong by killing them? That doesn't work to me. It doesn't work at all. And the rationale for capital punishment has never been, in my mind, satisfactory. It doesn't deter. It's not cheaper. Any of those arguments simply don't work. But even if they did, the basis still is you can't violate a basic human principle and expect, on the other hand, to implement it in other areas. So it really depends, I think, on which one is most important. I don't know. I think you could build a case for saying that we need to eliminate capital punishment and work on that issue if we're really going to address some of the other issues as well. But that one gets in the way. Women's rights, racial rights, gay lesbian issues. Certainly with the gay lesbian population struggling for being treated fairly these days, that's one that is very much active and alive in our society. As I'm talking, I will get to one that I think is crucial, that I think we need to deal with. And that's the widening gap between the rich and the poor. That's the basis of revolution. That's the basis of societal unrest. That's the basis of anger and frustration. And if we as society turn away from that one, even in the interests of pursuing others, if we turn away from that basic struggle, we're going to find society in deep trouble and deep collapse. That's not very optimistic, is it? Yes? It's pretty much universal. Not from the same perspective, but somehow it's gotten built into this 100 years thing. Within the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's not accurate either. I mean, we don't turn at the year 2000. I mean, we're already past the millennium if you do it historically accurately. So it's not really a solidly thought-through kind of thing. It's more of a gut feel. It's as we flip this chart from the year 1999 or 2000 to the year 2000 or 2001, however you exactly do that. But it's like coming to an end of something rather than looking at the beginning of something. It's coming to an end of something rather than see ourselves on a process. And as we come butting up against that, I think we're going to see more, there are spaceships behind the comet kind of thing, because it brings out some very, very extreme kinds of thinking. And as I suggested, the extreme thinking, well, people have a right to that if they want. Extreme thinking often starts violating the rights of folks. Extremists, absolutists, do not respect the rights of other people because they get in the way of their extremist position. So education, awareness, moving people into a broader perspective so that they don't get stuck in those extremist positions, very important. Very important as we go through this next couple of years, but very important generally. Please. You first, and then I'll go here.
Well, I guess what I'm looking for is there's no roadmaps, obviously, but since you've been tinkering with human rights for a long time, more than tinkering, excuse me, but
No, that's okay.
what is, if you were to decide that tomorrow you wanted to champion something you felt was important, or you were a young person trying to figure out how to build yourself strength, yourself to be that champion, how would you go about it?
I would build bridges. I would build networks. I would build coalitions. I would expand my circles. I would move out of my comfort zones, which is easy to say because this is what we're promoting right now with the coalition, is we really believe in community-based groups that are representative of that community to address the issue of human rights and address the issue of bigotry, that's the way we think communities really will make some change. And I think it's that kind of building bridges and building coalitions and building networks and coming together across gender and across sexual orientation differences and across racial and religious differences and across ideological, philosophical differences as well, and saying we are in this boat together, we are on this globe together, we are in this community together. We respect each other enough to say let's work together to figure out how to make this best for us all. I know that's a Pollyanna kind of approach, but I really think that's where we need to go. I don't think any of us can do it individually. I don't think any of us can do it just staying within our own comfort zones and within our own little circle of friends. That's part of it where we find our support. but we need to venture out of that into realizing that there's a broader society and a broader world that we have to connect to. And that might mean doing some traveling if we have the freedom to do that, to see what some other cultures have to say, to see what some other groups of people have to say. I really like North Idaho, I really like Coeur d'Alene, and I enjoyed my time here very, very much, but I have to say, I love Seattle. And one of the reasons I love Seattle is because of the diversity there that you don't have here. There's a diversity there that's extremely enriching. You know, I get off the bus on First Avenue, I'm hearing all kinds of languages and seeing all kinds of cultures right there. I don't have to bring in 3 or 4 people to do a presentation for me. It's right there. That kind of diversity of experience to me is most valuable and most important and very enriching to me. I like that. I think we all need to move into that, to seeing that diversity. I don't mean everybody's got to move to Seattle, but find your own ways of reaching out a little bit and expanding your circle to build those kinds of coalitions, to build those bridges, and then to come together to work in positive directions to build things. I think we have more allies than we realize, and I think we have more in common than we realize, and I think we can build some of those bridges more easily than maybe our paranoia and fears might want us to. I guess building bridges, I'm quoting the president. I think I said it first. He stole it from me. Over here, please.
Kind of answered one of my questions. I was going to say, what are some practical things? You say don't stand idle, but in addition to what you were saying there, why don't we have diversity here? I mean, I'm from Philadelphia, and I was raised amongst a lot of diversity, and that was one of my big concerns about living here. You know, my 4 children, they're going to not, see everyone that just like them. And my other question is, these Aryan groups and supremacist groups, are they getting larger?
Now you hit my area of expertise. How much longer do you want? No. Well, I think others that here could talk to you in terms of diversity. There is diversity here. The Coeur d'Alene tribe is here and have been here long before most of the rest of us were here. There is some diversity here. Sections of our country that don't have a great deal of diversity, mostly that's a matter of historical and economic development. Different groups of people had different work and skills, and those skills were exercised in different areas. So, the Coeur d'Alene mining area has one particular ethnic group because those folks came from Europe who were miners. And that kind of historical development is very much a part of what establishes a diversity in one area or a dozen. Then what keeps it from changing as we go through time? Well, part of it is the kind of reputation and image that a place gets. Somebody just told me from here a couple of days ago that there's a corporation in town that is looking for some computer programmers and is offering a very high salary, but can't get people from outside the area to move in here to accept those roles even at a very high salary because they're concerned about the lack of racial mix and about the image that's here. So part of what's impacting this community right now is that image that's based on some level of reality, but that image that this area is not friendly, and in the worst scenario is unfriendly to people of diversity, to people with different cultures and different backgrounds. That's part of what we're going to be addressing Saturday night, frankly. The business community has gotten together and saying, enough's enough. We are friendly, we are open, we are going to do something about this. We're not going to let this reputation impact us this way. And so, that's a step in the direction of making something happen. In terms of, and I have to answer her second question. She slipped 2 of them in there. In terms of extremist groups, Aryan nations, etc., are they getting stronger or weaker? The Aryan nations as a specific group has gained some strength in recent years compared to what it was about 5 years ago, but isn't anywhere near as strong as it was about 15 years ago. So there's a little upsy downsy wavesy thing there. In terms of the whole Northwest or the whole country, though, there's an important shift that took place a couple of years ago. And that was that white supremacy shifted from the very visible white supremacist groups such as the Aryan nations and the Ku Klux Klan. And they stepped over into what's called the Christian Patriot organization. Christian patriots are those folks who are jumping on the anti-government sentiment bandwagon and are headed on that track. White supremacy said that's a good track because a lot of people are anti-government. And so let's jump on that bandwagon because we have a lot broader appeal that way. We have a broader base to recruit from, and so they did. And now some of the Christian patriot movement has direct ties to white supremacy. John Trockman with the militia of Montana, for example, is a white supremacist who has turned very clearly into the Christian patriot militia mold. Others have done so as well. And they've instilled in that whole Christian patriot movement an underlying ideology, philosophy that looks at the American Constitution in a way that promotes society that gives more rights to some and less to others. So they've managed to continue their racism without standing up and saying, I hate people of color, or whatever term they would use. Now they simply say, I'm not a racist, I'm friends with everybody, I can put my arm around a person of color. But this is what American society should look like. And American society should look like what it looked like 200 years ago. And as we all know, American society as it was 200 years ago did not give equal rights to everybody. It gave more rights to some and less rights to others. And they go into some gyrations with the 13th, 14th Amendment, et cetera, to help establish that. So they've shifted. And the racism is now cloaked over with this anti-government sentiment and with under the wave of the Constitution, under the banner of the Constitution. So they'll come holding the Constitution in your face saying, we're just for the Constitution, and the Constitution says freedom and justice for everybody, so don't call me a racist anymore. But as a matter of fact, what they're promoting often is. That group has grown substantially in the last couple of years, has expanded substantially, and has many, many more numbers. I don't think anybody has an exact percentage-wise of do we have a larger percentage than others. That this is in a way eastern Washington, western Montana, northern Idaho, that this is in a way ground zero. If you want, yes, we have enough. We have more than enough. So rather than say, are we worse off than others, it's a problem that's around the country. It's a problem that we have as well. It's a problem that we have in this area too much of. There's a better way than to try to say, are we worse than others? That's an impossible comparison. It is a problem that's universal. We had a trial in Seattle of militia members that just ended a few days ago. They have a trial in Arizona of militia folks going on soon. There's just a trial in Georgia of militia folks that happen. There's going to be a problem in Texas here very shortly as a militia group is setting up confrontation with law enforcement. So, I mean, it's a problem that's around the country, not just here. Please, in the back, and then we'll get to you, ma'am.
So many different ideologies throughout our country, especially even, seemingly those ones that are against human rights. How do you bring all people, even on a global level, to come into this basic foundation of human rights?
Yeah. I guess you have to start with a fundamental belief. At least that's how I feel. I have to do it anyway. I start with a fundamental belief in human beings. And I believe that fundamentally a human being, if allowed to be free, and if spared from excessive fears, and if relieved from excessive angers, if you can kind of strip some of those things away and work through some of those things, that fundamentally a human being is going to come to the truth about how to live with himself, herself, and how to live with each other. And so the process is a complicated one. I mean, it's a process of building a society where people are free from anger and from fear, for example, because that anger and that fear is going to get in the way of understanding themselves and their relationships to others. So that's a part of doing it. But then to really search in our own hearts and our own souls and in our own spirits and in the spirits of each other, we can find it. I really do believe that if you can set two people down, and if you can work your way through the fears, and if you can work your way past the angers, if you can set those two people down, you can work it out so that they can say together, this is the way that we need to live to be able to respect each other and to get along and to build something productive and build something positive. So I think it starts with a basic confidence and trust in the human spirit and in us, individually and collectively. Then how do we go about it? The bridge building is one of the ways. Education, awareness, to understand, to enable us to be thinkers, to be able to think things through to consequences, to be able to take information and fact and come to some kind of basis of truth, to be able to think our way away from paranoia, to think our way away from unbased conspiracy theories, to think our way toward not necessarily everybody thinking exactly the same. I think there's a lot of ways you can look at water, for example. I can look at water from a scientific point of view. I can look at water from a thirsty person point of view. I can look at water as something that cleanses me. I can look at water as something to play on. All of those are valid understandings of water. They're not exactly the same. But if I can get all of the people who are looking at water to sit at the same table and talk about their perception of water, all of us are better off because of it. So the same kind of thing when we're looking at how do we relate as human beings. What does it mean to be a human being? We don't have to have all the same perspective. I can look at it from my tradition. You can look at it from yours. We can sit down together, and as long as my perspective is an accurate reflection, as long as I'm an accurate reflection of water, as long as I'm an accurate reflection of human life, then mine in combination with yours can come into a productive building mode. So we don't have to have the same perspectives by any means. But we have to respect each other enough and be comfortable enough in that respect that we can share ideas and build from that. Does that help? Okay. Please. I was in Sandpoint last night, and we were having a discussion like this, and as soon as we got on to English as official language, it was the end of the evening because we got on nothing else after that. It took the whole focus. So I'm practicing on how to be able to answer that question and steer us back to the question at hand. I think it has to do with, at least with what kind of a community do we want? What kind of community in terms of friendly to whom? And I think as we make decisions like English as official language, we have to ask ourselves, what is this saying in terms of our community and who it is friendly to and who it is not friendly to? And I think clearly English as official language says to people of immigrant background, says to people of who have different languages than English as their primary language, says to people who have different cultures, the message that goes to them quite clearly, in most cases, is that this community is not friendly to me. I think the message is pretty clear. Now, it doesn't mean that the people that passed it are racist. It doesn't mean that they had any racist intention at all. But you don't have to have a racist intention to hurt folks. You don't have to have a racist intention for it to, as a matter of fact, have racial implications. So you say, who do we want this community to be friendly to, and what's the message that it's sending? And then you ask yourself, if it's sending a hurtful message to some people, if it's, as a matter of fact, hurting people, then is it worth it? And I think the question mark here is, why was it necessary to pass the thing in the first place? English is the official language, the functioning language of society and of government. It is already. There's no threat to that at all. So there doesn't seem to be anything gained by passing it. And certainly the message that has been sent is a message that's unfriendly to people of diverse backgrounds. Now, doesn't mean that people shouldn't learn English, that they don't learn. They do. Historically, 94 or 95% of first-generation immigrants learn English, and 100% of the second generation do. And so it's not a matter of do you learn English or don't you. Historically, everybody does. Everybody knows that to function in American society, you have to learn English. Everybody knows that. Everybody does it. So let's put our attention in helping people learn English rather than put our attention in somehow mandating that this needs to be a language. That's my thought. Please. Very interesting, good question. She asked where abortion rights and right to life fits in here. There is a covenant, or I don't know the exact word, but a thing that the American nations, the nations of North and South America, got together and formed on human rights in the early 70s. And in that, it states that the right to life is a right that belongs to everyone from the moment of conception. And so it includes right to life. It includes an anti-abortion stance. The United States has not signed that one either, for a couple of reasons. One of them is because of this stance on abortion. And the other one is because of that same agreement stance against capital punishment. And also, I'm sure, because there, too, the United States never wants to sign anything that we feel is somehow going to give something bigger than us authority over us. And so it's refused to sign that covenant as well. So we certainly have an issue here in terms of right to life around the abortion question. And here is one of the questions where rights and rights start seeming to collide. I'm not sure they do, but they seem to collide. Because you have also the right of a woman to determine the functioning and the care of her own body. And so it's a question that as you're looking at it, you're going to have to debate along those kinds of lines. It's the right of a woman to care for her own body, and it's also the right of life from conception. Then you get into questions, of course, of when is a fetus a human person? If you could fully establish that it's not a human person until the moment of birth, for example, then you've got the question solved, that human life and the right to human life begins at birth, not at conception. Those who argue against abortion say there's at least enough evidence to suggest that a human person begins earlier than that, that you have to say that there is a right to life prior to birth. So it's a debate back and forth. I don't think anybody would argue that the right of a woman over her body includes the right to take the life of another human being, just any more than they would say a woman or anybody else has a right to murder their child after birth. So there's some really interesting questions there in that whole struggle. But it's both sides are arguing based on a human right. The human right that says life begins at the right to life, they would say it begins at conception, and the human right for a woman to have control over her own body. So you're not going to get a solution to that one by just the human rights question, because it also has to do with when does human life begin, and has to do with some factual information that's debatable.
Getting back to the question regarding the supremacists, why do you think they've acquired so much power? And if we could find the answer to that question, is that the key to be taking their power back away from them? I mean, does it have to do with the fall of communism? Because as a country, we were banded together in a fight against communism and keeping the world safe. Since that became less of a threat, was that one of the reasons these people sought something else to make them powerful?
Well, white supremacy has been around even when communism was a threat. So it's not quite that easy, unfortunately. It's been around for quite a while it's been around as long as our country's been around. In fact, we were established by white supremacists who overpowered the native peoples and exterminated them on a basis of white superiority. And that's part of our history that we have to learn to live with and reconcile. So it's been around as long as the United States has been around. Certainly, the lack of focus of an outside of our country enemy has enabled people to find time to struggle more internally. Certainly that part of it is true. But I think that the rationale has to go much deeper if we're looking for a reasoning basis for it. Some of what's triggering the current involvement in this kind of level of extremism is a dissatisfaction with government. And some of that dissatisfaction with government, at least, is sound, is got a good basis for it. It's not too difficult to stir up anti-government sentiments today because there's plenty of explanations to give you just cause, if you want. So at least some of it. Now that's built into a paranoia and into a conspiracy that goes way beyond reason, to where government can do nothing good and government is the enemy on all fronts. Government functions well on a lot of areas in our country, does a lot of good things for us, and we need government. Point is, fix it rather than abandon it. But they use that anti-government sentiment. There's also pervasive, I think, and this is just, we're heading into some speculation in this one, but there's also persuasive, I think, in our land of fear. Just a very strong fear, we're doing a public relations campaign with the PSA that we're making actually right now, that we're going to broadcast and start putting out in a couple of months, the Northwest Coalition. And it's let's fight the fear together, or what are you afraid of? We chose that fear concept because there's a pervading kind of fear amongst so many people. Part of it maybe is because society is moving so fast, and people are fearful that they're being left out. You hear even little tones of this sometime with people when they try to defend themselves to say, I'm not going to learn how to run a computer. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to run a computer, but when you hear some people talking about that, you almost hear a little fear behind it saying, I'm going to take a stand somewhere, by gum. This society is moving too fast, and it's not going to usurp me on all fronts, and so this is it. I'm not going to learn how to run a computer. No. Well, again, you don't have to learn how to run a computer if you don't want to, but what I think it sometimes says is that I can't keep up. I'm afraid I'm losing out here. Society is moving right on past me. And at the same time that the person says, I'm not going to learn how to run a computer, they know full well that they have, by that choice, disempowered themselves from a major part of society. Because computers are going to be a part of our society. They are being a part. I mean, they know that somehow. And that scares the daylights out of them. Or political power. That we can't make a difference. We can't impact it. It's controlled by money. I can't do anything there. I'm afraid of what's happening there. Or I'm afraid of this tragedy or that tragedy or biological weapons. I mean, you can come up with a lot of things that kind of build some of that paranoia and build some of that fear. But society is moving so fast. Changes are happening so rapidly that many people, I think, are just scared internally and deeply internally. And at the same time that those changes are happening, what's happened also is that many of their security pegs have been sawed off. They no longer find security in their family structure because that's been kind of rent asunder. They no longer find security in their job because job security is kind of shaky these days. I mean, downsizing, upsizing, all that sort of stuff. They no longer find security in their geographic location community because they move all the time. And so a lot of the underlying pinions that have supported us, that enabled us to face fears before, are no longer there. And so we start heading for a simplistic answer to things, and that's extremism. And when we get pushed into extremism because of those fears, then we block off a whole section of the world, and we don't see all of this that's going on. We only see with our own set of blinders, and that's the worldview that we're going to be focusing on. And that's a downward path. So that's what I think is kind of behind a bunch of it is fear, and fear that drives us to extremism. And then that extremism happens, then we become absolutists, and in absolutism we start violating the rights of other folks and pronounce scapegoats. And once you get locked into a really absolutist position, you no longer can negotiate with anybody else. To the advantage of those of us who don't believe in extremism or absolutism, absolutist folks are also absolutist in relation to other absolutists. So they can't cooperate very well. So there's not any great movement of unity out there amongst the absolutists. There's these absolutists and these absolutists and these absolutists, and they fight as much with each other as they do with everybody else. That's good. Because if all the absolutists got together all at the same time, they'd be a pretty strong force. And every so often you see the absolutists on the right joining forces with the absolutists on the left. That's a little bit scary too, when those start coming that full circle around. Let's work on that middle. Let's work on a balanced education. Let's give our children the ability and the training to think, to let them think through things and give them the information that they need from now and from historical time so that as they think, they can think from a solid foundation rather than think from crazy stuff that's going to lead them in funny directions. Make them critical. Help them be critical. Help them be able to think. So that we can move through this time without those kinds of paranoias and fears and mistruths and half information. Please.
Other than education, what else do you think is the path or the answer to overcoming our fears?
I think we need support systems. If you don't have that within your family context, find it amongst your friend context. If you don't have it in your church context, find it in a spirit context of some sort. Find support systems. None of us can expect to do this on our own by our sheer mental power, somehow, or determination. We all need to find those kinds of levels of support, and we all need to find places where we can be comfortable. We all need to find places where we can be who we are, and that's within support systems. And those aren't natural to us today in the sense that they automatically happen to us anymore, as perhaps they used to. I'm not sure that ever was true, but it's less true perhaps today than it was before. So find them. Find them for yourselves and build them so that you can have that sense of security that is just crucial. A friend of mine said, I guess it was actually during the Gulf War when my wife and I went down to visit her in Portland because we were really distressed by the way things were going in our society. And so we went down and just spent some time with her, a very wise person that I like to just go sit at her feet once in a while and say, let me soak some in. And she just said, during these kinds of times, be sure you take care of yourself. Because if you don't take care of yourself, and by that she meant find these kinds of support systems. So if you don't take care of yourself, as we work our way through these times, you won't be in a place to be able to be a productive part of society in the future. So find those support systems. I think that's crucial. Education is crucial. Find the level that you're able to be involved. The movement for justice, the movement for respect for all is like a big river, and it's flowing. Some of us all of us can contribute to that river. Some of us contribute in one way, others contribute in another way. Find what your level of contribution to that river is. It might be joining the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. It might be joining the Northwest Coalition. It might be that kind of level of organized work. It might be teaching in your Sunday school. It might be working through your Kiwanis, or your might be working through different organizations, service organizations that are here, and putting in human rights, respect for all persons thrust in there. It might be hosting an international student in your home. It might be working with your school through the educational system. It might be cooperating with Martin Luther King Day celebrations. I mean, there's just a ton of different kinds of things out there that you can be involved in. Find the one that works for you. Hello, David. Find the one that works for you and do it. Take those steps. Everybody can do something to make that river flow better. Everybody can do something to make human rights more of a reality in our society. Find what that is for you and then do it. Make that choice. Have the education and the solid security base and the support system so that you're able to do it, and then do it. Please. Yes?
I was just wondering, as an educator, I see young teens, young adolescents really struggling with a lot of issues, finding the terminology of rights and
Right.
finding the misinterpretation. Where do you see, and we have issues with reality and separation of church and state? I see it as a joint task and challenge and all those things. Where do you see avenues that are really capital model, have people interested in
Yeah.
that, have these discussions, that talk about these issues? I see that as a really challenge.
I think it's a challenge everywhere. As a part of preparation for our public service announcement, the people that are producing that went to Moscow to the university to do a couple of focus groups amongst students there, thinking that we'd get something of a rural perspective, but in a context where they'd feel more comfortable to talk. They came away from those focus groups with some startling information that those young people were very, very, very confused in their thinking about society and politics and how we get along with each other. Very confused. Things like saying, my two heroes in the public arena are Pat Buchanan and Jesse Jackson, and seeing no kind of contradiction there at all between that. Or to say, I think so-and-so is a real problem because of their views. I think they're this or that. And then in the next breath, spouting some of those same views as the things that guide their life. Now, the plus of that is that that's what the young people are at the university for, is to search through these things and hopefully make some progress. The concerning thing is that at least the people that ran these focus groups felt that at that stage that they were missing some pretty foundational things that were going to help them be able to think through that. So I think we've got some room to go there. How do we do this? There's some good projects going. There's some real good projects. Sandpoint, for example, with their task force has some really good junior high, senior high kinds of groups that are involved there that are exciting. We're running a leadership training this summer for a week down in Jackson, Wyoming for youth to be able to go back to their schools and to do some thinking and creativeness here. I think if young people are given the opportunity, they can do a lot peer group-wise amongst themselves to help each other think in positive ways about putting some good foundations to this. We need to give them the opportunity as well as to give them the background to be able to do that. There are some models out there for that that are starting to function more and more. Please.
Yes, I'm going to follow up that question and that answer because the question you just asked is a good one because I encounter some young people, not a lot of them. I'm glad to see a lot of young people here today because I encounter young people, friends of a teenager in my own house, that have some of this disenchantment with our electoral system, that thought that it doesn't work anymore. And I listen to them, but I also tell them why I think that's not entirely correct.
Mm-hmm.
But having that kind of a sentiment at that age makes them especially vulnerable to being recruited into some of these more absolutist groups. And so we have to keep communicating with them, listening to them and communicating with them. We can't have an attitude that, well, you don't know what you're talking about, because they have some factual basis for
You bet.
being happy with everything that's going on.
You bet. You bet. Young people work off of a basis of idealism, and the reality in face of the idealism often needs them very frustrated. But we need to do something in a way that doesn't crush that idealism. Yep, exactly. Good point. Thank you. Yes?
In an effort to heighten awareness in our youth, do you think it would be a worthy cause or worthy effort to try to include in curriculum, intro to world religion classes, things like that, at an early age instead of waiting until college to offer such information to our youth?
Yes, very much so. And I think there is age-appropriate education on this matter that's available now, and that it just needs to be put in effectively. And some school districts, frankly, are doing that quite well. That they're making real progress on this. Yeah, there are those who say that we need to start. Are you showing something there? Oh, okay. I thought you were showing a curriculum, maybe, that you were saying, here's one. There's a program that's been developed, and I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head, but that says we need to start with early childhood, even preschool time. That when a child first starts recognizing that he or she is different from the other children, in terms of race or in terms of size or in terms of color or in terms of gender, when the child first starts realizing that he or she is different, how the child is helped to go through those very initial encounters are going to affect the way the child deals with the rest of their lives. If they see those differences and are coached somehow that they need to be competitive with those differences, so you're a boy, I'm a girl, I'm going to have to compete with you somehow, that's going to stay with them for a long time, that competitiveness. If they see that difference as threat, if that's the way they're kind of coached, is that it's a threat, that's going to stay with them. If, on the other hand, if their environment suggests to them that that difference is not an automatic foundation for competition, but rather difference is something that's good, and that is enjoyable, and that is enriching, and that I don't have to compete, that I am confident enough that I can hold my position here without competing, and that they see that difference not as a threat, that's the kind of context that might stay with them the rest of their lives in terms of as they grow into learning about other differences around them. So I think it's a personal, attitudinal thing as well as a gathering of information thing that some of us have to recover from, frankly, because we grew up with attitudes that are much different. I grew up in a very, very sexist environment. And that's going to it takes a long time for that to get out of here. I can move it out of here. It takes a long time to get out of here. I mean, my father clearly taught me that women can't do some things. Driving anything mechanical was one of them. So when I get on an airplane and the pilot's voice comes over and says, "Good morning, this is your pilot," and it's a woman's voice, my gut says, "Off of here. How do you get out of here?" You know, my dad's voice is pretty strong. She can't drive a car. How in the world can she fly an airplane? Now my head takes over and says, sure. I mean, she can fly an airplane. Nothing says she can't. I can go on. But if I'm daydreaming or something, when that voice comes on, my dad's voice is the one that's deep in here. And that one comes out clearly. So, I mean, we've got some things to recover from. All of us do in terms of our childhood. When we're dealing with our children today, let's help them not have quite as many things to recover from. Please. Yeah. 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 What about, I'm sorry? Okay. Well, in regard to your first question, I would think it was more of a statement than a question, and I agree with the statement. I mean, nobody is suggesting that the nations of the world have functioned properly in relation to each other on all fronts by any means. And nobody, including the United States, has done that. And one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, what are we doing for peace and human rights in the world by being one of the major arms exporters of the world? That gets back to, do we promote human rights by establishing the weaponry of murder and of killing? I don't know about that. I think we got a lot of work to do there. But I think if your question on has to do with the legitimacy or viability of the United Nations, certainly the United Nations hasn't been functioning 100% either. Nothing in our society, including the United Nations, is perfect. On the other hand, that we need some kind of international body where the nations of the world can come together to see if they can't figure out a way to deal with each other more effectively, that we need such a group, most certainly. Absolutely. The time of nations being alone in this globe is over. That's past. We are globalized, we are internationalized in terms of economies, in terms of dependency on each other for flow of goods, etc. All that stuff has already happened. And so the political thing of getting the peoples and the nations together politically is in a way behind what has already happened on so many different fronts. So that we need it, absolutely. That it's functioning perfectly, certainly not. That it needs a lot of room to be improved, certainly yes. Your second question in terms of seatbelts and restrictions, right? Okay, laws are there to protect lives. That's what the seatbelt law is for. That's why speed limit laws are there. We as society, through our representatives, say this is what we agree to do. We agree to it based on factual information. We agree to it based on what we know as best we know it. We got to a point of saying speed limits save lives. More people die if we go faster. That's factually provable. So we decide to say as a society, we're going to put some limits on here. The exact limit has varied, as we well know. Sometimes it's been a little higher, sometimes it's been a little lower. But we as society agreed to the common rules that we're going to work with. We agreed to a common rule in terms of seatbelts, because there also the evidence said saves lives. My mother's alive today because of a seatbelt. Clearly, she'd be dead if it wasn't. No doubt in our minds at all with the accident that she had. So, I mean, they save lives. That's why we have that kind of restriction. We as society agree in a democratic society through our elected officials, these are the rules we're going to live by. And that impacts us. That restricts us. My rights, my ability to function is always bounced off in relation to the rights of others around us. If I live all by myself, I can write all the rules. If there's two of us living in the same house, then we got to come up with something that's agreeable. If there's 10 million of us in a society, we got to come up with something that works for all 10 million. There are 6 billion of us in the world. And so it's going to be a complicated process to figure out how we share the resources of this world through 6 billion of us in a way that keeps us fair and keeps us respectful of each other. That's why something like the United Nations Bill of Rights is so crucial, because that sets kind of the foundational rules off of which we can work to make sure that all 6 billion of us are able to live here with some peace and some security and some justice. Okay? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Wait till I get over here. Yeah. 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 Complicated issue. Others? Okay, I guess we're done. She's saying, thank you all very much. And feel free to pick up a